I think still it's not just that we're conscious, but that our consciousness has this very particular character.
Consciousness is perhaps the biggest riddle in nature.
It's one thing to understand what the mathematics says, and it's another thing entirely to interpret the mathematics.
Consciousness right now is a kind of anomaly, one that we need to integrate into our view of the world, but we don't yet see how.
There's a nagging sense that there's still something special about consciousness that can't be captured by classical physics alone.
What's a thought? Where in time, space, matter, energy is a thought?
I want a scientific theory of consciousness that works.
Yeah, there's no guarantee that there will be a final ultimate theory of consciousness, but I know there's a guarantee that there will not be such a theory if we don't try.
My mate Philip, he is the world's most famous panpsychist, and as a panpsychist he thinks that the universe is pervaded by consciousness. Furthermore, he thinks that the universe is made out of consciousness. The fundamental little bits in the universe are conscious.
And our conscious understanding of the world is permeated with meaning and understanding. What things are and what they mean is built into the character of our conscious experience. So there's a deep question here, why did consciousness evolve at all, right? Why didn't natural selection just make us sort of complicated survival mechanisms that can sort of mechanically track the world and respond to it?
Developmental biology offers no specific place where you can draw a sharp line and say, okay, at time t, this was just physics and chemistry, but look, there the cognition now appeared.
Every step along the way, we can understand what light is doing to specific molecules in the retina, how those molecules affect downstream neuronal firing. As you drill down on the micro details, there are no surprises. Like the causality makes sense all the way through.
Our perception of this present moment, of now, as something special, it doesn't exist in the fundamental laws of nature.
What doesn't make sense at all, at some point along the way, there's something that it's like to see. In our case, we have the full pyrotechnics of conscious life. We have the conscious experience of vision. That is fundamentally mysterious.
When we're dealing with consciousness, it's not a purely scientific question.
In today's episode, Professor Philip Goff talks about panpsychism, cosmopsychism, panagentialism, and the meaning of the universe. And there's also some other interesting stuff which you're going to have to stick around in order to find out. Enjoy.
Panpsychism is the view that consciousness goes right down to the fundamental building blocks of reality, with fundamental particles like electrons and quarks having incredibly simple forms of experience to reflect their incredibly simple nature. And then the very complex experience of the human or animal brain is somehow built up from these more simple forms of consciousness at the level of fundamental physics. So it doesn't necessarily mean literally everything is conscious. The basic commitment is that the fundamental building blocks of reality may be fundamental particles, but whatever the fundamental building blocks are, they have very rudimentary forms of consciousness. So yeah, it doesn't mean a rock is conscious, it just means maybe the smallest bits the rock is made up of are conscious.
He's also a cosmopsychist, which means rather than as the physicists do, physicists believe in this concept of emergence, right? Which is that all of the little bits have these local interactions, and then you get multi-scale information sharing and multi-scale interactions, and, the purposes kind of emerge through these multiple levels of information sharing. Goff's panpsychism involves a form of emergence, but not in the traditional sense, where complex systems have properties which their components lack. In Goff's constitutive panpsychism, he says that basic particles themselves have rudimentary consciousness, and complex consciousness emerges from these simpler forms. This is in contrast to someone like Friston, who says that when you have a certain amount of complexity going up the emergence ladder, then you get the consciousness, but you don't have the consciousness lower down.
When people talk about panpsychism, they tend to talk about conscious particles, and I often do that myself for the sake of simplicity. But actually, many theoretical physicists are more inclined to think that our universe is made up not of little billiard ball particles, but of universe-wide fields. This fits better, for example, with quantum field theory, and that particles are really just local excitations in those fields. So if you combine this view with panpsychism, then we get the view that the fundamental forms of consciousness underlie these universe-wide fields. The most basic mind is the bearer of those fields, namely the universe itself. So this is what we call cosmopsychism, the view that the universe as a conscious entity is the fundamental thing.
The universe as a whole thing is the most appropriate lens that we should use to understand what's going on. But then, curiously, he talks about this concept called Panagentialism. As well as thinking that the universe is made up of these tiny little bits of consciousness, he's also kind of arguing that there's a continua of agency, that agency is some kind of fundamental material that the world is made out of, and things in the universe have increasing amounts of those little bits of agency.
Yeah, I guess we do tend to think that purpose or agency is just a human thing, the result of millions of years of natural selection, and that it's very much an idiosyncratic thing, cosmically speaking, right? It's just this thing that pops up in this tiny corner of space-time. Cosmopsychism, or these Panagentialist views, where not only consciousness but agency go all the way down to the fundamental level. In a way, you can think of them as very Copernican, right? Because we're not saying human agency, human consciousness is this really special thing, this little local miracle. Rather, human agency, human consciousness is a highly evolved form of what exists throughout the universe.
Philip said in his book that proto-agency plus experiential understanding is equal to agency. I think by experiential understanding, he means consciousness when he says experience, and by understanding, I think he means intentionality. A major component of understanding is reinterpreting or reconstructing the intentions of other agents. And it's not possible to do this without understanding the experiences of other agents and the world that we live in, which is kind of synonymous with purpose. When we intend to do something over a long horizon, we have purpose. Now, it's interesting to contrast this with Professor Carl Friston and his free energy principle and active inference, because he also says that even though you get these dynamical systems with homeostasis, they're just made up of little bits of material. But when you have sufficient levels of nested self-organization, then agency emerges when those things are effectively planning. It's as if they're planning. And when something plans, it has an intention, and it's kind of sense-making. It can create meaning. So these ideas are very, very similar. But Philip, of course, is arguing that the universe is made up out of what I visualize as two swimming pools. In one swimming pool, you have the proto-agency. In the other swimming pool, you have the consciousness. So you could think of this as a dual aspect view, philosophically. So he's kind of saying that when you mix little bits of those swimming pools together, meaning and proto-agency, you get the emergence of agents even at the very smallest level in the universe and all over the universe. We're saying agency is important, and the entire universe is a bit like a god. It's a bit like an agent. But then there's the question of if it's top-down or bottom-up. So physicists are bottom-up, and they would, even in the cosmopsychist view, they would presumably think that the agency bubbles up from the bottom, and then you can think of the universe as having directedness, but it's actually a diffusion or a confection of all of these kind of loci of agential density lower down. But the other way of thinking about it is there's some kind of top-down design or teleology. So how do you interpret that on the cosmopsychism?
I mean, I think we just have to try and follow the evidence where it leads. We're very well trained in the West, I think, to be alert to religious biases. You know, if you have a certain religious upbringing, that might bias your thinking in a certain way. But I think we're not very well primed for thinking about secular biases, right? Maybe our conception of science has a certain bias in it. And I tend to think there is a certain bias towards this idea of a meaningless, purposeless universe that makes you feel a bit silly if you start talking about cosmic purpose. I feel a bit silly talking about these things myself. Really, I think we should just look where the evidence leads. And I think things like the fine-tuning of physics for life, on the face of it, in our standard Bayesian ways of thinking about evidence, is pretty powerful evidential support for the idea of cosmic purpose. And I suspect future generations will look back and think it's a bit weird that we just ignored that evidence for so long. And I think it's really just cultural bias.
So, Philip, could you introduce this idea of Panagentialism that you introduced in the book?
So Panagentialism is the view that not only consciousness but agency has its roots at the fundamental level of reality. That in some sense, even fundamental particles have some very crude or rudimentary form of agency. Nothing is ever compelled to behave. Rather, things respond rationally to the character of their experience. In some sense, things are making choices. So you might think, well, hold on, if things are sort of making choices, if things aren't compelled, why do we get a predictable world? An agent is something that responds to considerations of value, right? This might be something grand, like, advancing scientific knowledge, finding a cure for cancer, helping the suffering of the world. Or it might be just something very simple, like, this feels good, so I'm going to do it again. I think that is also a way of responding to what you have reason to do. It feels good, I'm going to do it again. So on the Panagentialist view, particles, because they are so crude and simple, because they can't rationally deliberate, because they don't understand the world around them, the only rational response available to them is this simplest form: do what you feel like doing, right? So if you're a mature human being and you feel like doing something, you can reflect and think, is this a good idea? Maybe I shouldn't lash out. Maybe I shouldn't eat that chocolate if I'm on a diet or something. But if you're a particle and you don't understand anything, the only rational response available is just do what you feel like doing, follow your desires, as it were. So that's why at the level of fundamental physics, on this view, we have a very simple, predictable world, because although these particles are responding rationally, they're in some sense agents or proto-agents, if you like. They're just acting on that very simplest of impulses. Do what you feel like doing. But then as we get evolution and we get the emergence of creatures that can rationally respond to the environment around them, then we start to get more sophisticated flowerings of rationality, more sophisticated value responses to the world. That's the core of agency for me. It's sort of value responses. And the motivation for this position is addressing a really unexplored challenge in the domain of consciousness, which is just making sense of why consciousness evolved. Right? Because natural selection just cares about behavior, right? It's only behavior that matters for survival. Whereas, as we've got more complicated AI and robotics, I think it's become apparent that you can have incredibly complex forms of behavior and information processing without any kind of consciousness or inner experience. So there's a deep question here, why did consciousness evolve at all? Right? Why didn't natural selection just make us sort of complicated survival mechanisms that can sort of mechanically track the world and respond to it? Maybe some philosophers think we are like that, but I don't myself. So this Panagentialism, I think, addresses this deep challenge, because once you have this theory of reality, then you just need natural selection, right? Once we have this idea that all matter is disposed to respond rationally to its experiences, then natural selection has motivation to give us consciousness, to give us conscious understanding of the world around us, because then we're going to respond rationally to it and survive better. So I do think consciousness evolved, but I think we need something like this Panagentialist picture to make sense of that. Some people say, well, if you're a panpsychist, why do you have this problem that consciousness evolved? Because sort of everything's conscious, or, But I think still it's not just that we're conscious, but that our consciousness has this very particular character, and our conscious understanding of the world is permeated with meaning and understanding what things are and what they mean is built into the character of our conscious experience. So in the book, I have this contrast with this idea of a meaning zombie, which has consciousness, but just has sort of meaningless, messy consciousness that doesn't add up to any coherent understanding of reality. If such a creature behaved just like us, then it would survive just as well. So again, we're back to this challenge. Why does evolution care about us having such a finely chiseled kind of conscious experience?
I like to give the example of carcinization in evolution, and that's this. It's called morphologically convergent evolution. So even though everyone would agree intuitively that evolution is a blind process of natural selection, but it seems directed, and that's because there are physical constraints on evolution. So there are lots of illusions around us that give the impression of directedness when in fact, well, you could say it's still directed, but not in the way that we understand it. That's the first thing, that you could argue that this is just the way we understand things. We have this cognitive concept called an agent, and we see the world in agents, whereas in fact the world is more complicated than we could ever understand.
Yeah, that's very tempting, isn't it, to think. And I suppose especially post-Darwin, right? We tend to think, people used to think, oh my God, it's just undeniable that there's real teleology, real purpose in organisms, as Aristotle believed, right? Before the scientific revolution, we had this Aristotelian worldview where things have goals built into their natures. So fire goes up because it's trying to reach its natural place in the heavens. Earth goes down, it's trying to reach its natural place which Aristotle took to be in the center of the universe. And especially when it comes to organisms, it just seems so undeniable. And then Darwin, this genius insight, and Wallace, I always think Wallace is so neglected. He had the idea as well. Natural selection gave us a way of explaining this that doesn't involve fundamental teleology or purpose. But I do worry that because that was such a radical, maybe unexpected shift in our thinking, that people think, oh, it's always going to be like that. It's always going to be like that, whenever there's any apparent evidence of purpose. And I'm suspicious of that kind of almost an idea that science has this sort of destiny of how it's inevitably going to go. Again, I just think we just have to look at the evidence. I think currently in physics, with the fine-tuning of physics for life, there is evidence of some sort of purposiveness. And so while that evidence is there, we need to try and explain it and accommodate it.
So purpose is a huge theme in your work, and I take it to mean our collective purpose as opposed to individual purposes, although the cone of the where we draw the boundary of agency we'll get to in a minute. But I might be really boring and nihilistic because I don't really care about having a purpose. And Professor Kenneth Stanley, I'm not sure if you've heard of him, but he's got this great book on why we shouldn't plan. Greatness cannot be planned. In a sense, you could argue that the best purpose is the lack of a purpose and this kind of serendipity. Why is purpose, or indeed the illusion of purpose, important for people?
So most of my book is just a cold-blooded scientific philosophical argument that actually there is cosmic purpose, in the sense of some kind of goal-directedness at the fundamental level of reality, whether we care about it or not. So, you could read my book and be convinced by that argument, but just think, doesn't matter for me. I make my own meaning. So that's perfectly consistent. So I disagree with those who think, such as the Christian philosopher William Lane Craig, that, if there's no purpose to the universe, it's all pointless, meaningless, we might as well just kill ourselves or whatever. So I disagree with that. On the other hand, if there is a purpose to the universe, I think there's a potential for more purpose and meaning in our own lives. If you can, in some way, contribute to the purposes of the whole of reality, that's huge, right? We want our lives to make a difference. That's about as big a difference as you can imagine. So yeah, if there's no purpose to the universe, I think we could still have meaningful lives. But if there is a purpose to the universe, maybe our lives can have more meaning.
What do you think is the meaning of life?
Wow, it's a big question. I guess I would, at least at first, prefer to ask the question, what is it to live a meaningful life? And I'm an objectivist about this. I don't think it's just up to you what is meaningful or not meaningful. I think there's a distinction between things that are worth doing and things that are not worth doing or less worth doing. So things like kindness, creativity, the pursuit of knowledge, I think these are deeply meaningful activities. And insofar as we spend our lives pursuing these kinds of things, then I think we can have deeply meaningful lives.
And final question on anthropocentrism. So religion, for example, is built in our own image. There's the anthropic principle. We spoke about agentialism, but also intelligence. Every definition of intelligence is anthropocentric to varying degrees. I guess the question is, we seem to just see ourselves.
Yeah.
And why is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is biases we need to be really alert to and aware of in ourselves. I think one wonderful thing about the time we're living in is that we have Bayes' theorem, which is a sort of mathematically precise way of capturing how evidence works. And so if we can very carefully apply that bit of mathematics, then we can hopefully be objective in a way that avoids our biases. I mean, Bayes' theorem is all about, right, which is the hypothesis that makes the evidence more likely, right, more probable. On the face of it, a straightforward application of Bayes' theorem to, you know, on the one hand, so if we take our evidence to be the fine-tuning of physics for life, the fact that of all the numerical values these constants might have had, they're in this narrow range necessary for life. We compare two hypotheses. Was that just chance? Or was that goal-directedness towards life at the fundamental level? Which hypothesis makes the evidence more likely? Well, on the face of it, it looks like the cosmic purpose hypothesis is the one that makes the evidence more likely, because if we go with the chance hypothesis, it's just incredibly unlikely you'd get the right numbers for life just by chance. So on the face of it, and Bayesian way of thinking about evidence ensures that the fine-tuning is incredibly powerful evidence for cosmic purpose. So I see these very real important concerns about whether we're being too anthropocentric as a sort of warning, check again your biases. But at the end of the day, if that's where the evidence is pointing, that's where the evidence is pointing.
I mean, you've said that you don't think physics is a coherent project with respect to consciousness. Why has physicalism failed to explain consciousness?
Physics on its own terms is doing great, right? I'm not here to tell physicists to do their job differently. But we've just got to think about what physics is in the business of doing, right? Physics is in the business of explaining publicly observable behavior. You've got some complex system, you explain its behavior in terms of simpler systems, smaller mechanisms, or the basic laws of physics. It's all about explaining complex behavior in terms of simpler behavior. That's a great explanatory project. What is so distinctive about consciousness is that it involves these qualities, the smell of coffee, the taste of mint. I don't think you can, as Galileo appreciated, I don't think you can fully articulate those qualities we find in our experience in the purely quantitative language of physical science. That's just a descriptive limitation, a limitation of the vocabulary of physical science, but I think it has explanatory implications, right? Because if you wanted to fully explain the qualities of experience in the purely quantitative vocabulary of neuroscience, you'd first have to articulate those qualities. You'd first have to fully characterize the redness of a red experience in the language of neuroscience, and then show how it can be accounted for in terms of patterns of neural firings or whatever. If you can't even articulate that quality, then I think you certainly can't explain it. So I mean, I really think that the whole project of trying to explain subjective experience and the qualities that populate subjective experience in the purely quantitative terms of physical science is ultimately not a coherent project.
There's this ontological gap, as we discussed. Physicists are building increasingly higher resolution models that have predictive power. Do you think that it's just a case of we need more resolution and we'll close that ontological gap? Or do you think, in principle, they will never, ever describe the reality that we live in because there's something missing?
Yeah, it's definitely an in principle problem. It's not simply we need higher resolution brain scanners or something. One way of seeing it is that there are just very different explanatory projects here, right? When we're trying to explain consciousness, we're not trying to account for publicly observable behavior, which is the bread and butter of physical science. So that's one point. Another way of thinking about it is that there's just very different concepts involved in, on the one hand, describing the character of our conscious experience, and on the other hand, describing the physical world. They're just very different kinds of vocabulary. If the gap would ever be closed, a colorblind neuroscientist will be able to learn what it's like to see red just from reading neuroscience. And that does seem absurd just because is a very different kinds of concept. The qualitative concept of seeing red is very different from the purely quantitative concepts we use in articulating neuroscience. And you know, it's interesting that in academic philosophy, the vast majority of physicalists now accept that because they've given up on this project of trying to tell some intelligible story about the emergence of consciousness in terms of neural activity in the way we've managed to tell an intelligible story about the liquidity of water in terms of underlying chemistry. Because these are such different concepts, you're not going to be able to close that explanatory gap to tell, which you'd need to do to tell that kind of explanatory story. So these days, physicalists try to argue that for some reason we just don't need to do that in the case of consciousness, which to my mind is sort of giving up, really. I mean, it's interesting if you look at scientists, physicalists in science, in neuroscience, they do take themselves to be obliged to tell that kind of explanatory story to solve the hard problem of consciousness, as it were. If you take the view of physicalists in science that we need to explain consciousness, if you take the view of physicalists in philosophy that we can't do that it's not a coherent project, you put those together, you get my view. So
no, there is an interesting thing. I mean, I was chastised for talking about panpsychism in the recent episode. Some guy came on the Discord server and said, "Why are you talking about all this pseudoscience?" is the word they use. My point is that it's not just scientism, I think it's empiricism. Physics is a philosophical position in itself, right?
Yeah, we're living in times that are really defined by scientism. You know, scientism is very much the religion of our times, this viewpoint that the only way to find out about reality is through doing experiments. One straightforward problem with that position, at least in its more extreme forms, is that it's self-defeating, right? Because scientism is a philosophical viewpoint that can't itself be experimentally supported, right? There's no peer-reviewed experimental evidence that demonstrates that the only way to find out about reality is by doing experiments. You know, we tried in the early 20th century to defend this view called logical positivism. All statements which can't be empirically defended are meaningless gibberish, and we tried to make sense of that. We worked out that it doesn't make sense, and I think, you know, like it or not, you can't get away from philosophical questions. I mean, maybe they're questions that we can never find the answer to, but then that in itself would be a philosophical viewpoint which, by its own lights, you can't find the answer to. So there's no easy way out of this. We just have to do some philosophy. And when people have this anti-philosophy zeitgeist, people still do philosophy. It's just not very good philosophy, right? Because it's not people who've been trained through reading the literature, having their views subject to peer scrutiny. I think where you learn most as an academic philosopher is the fact that you have to regularly give your talks at conferences. And what happens in the Q&A is people do their very best to tear apart your argument, not in a nasty way. That's what it's all about. It's, serious scrutiny. So I really think, I bang on about this all the time, and I was worrying recently, it probably looks like I'm like really bitter, crotchety old man going, no one takes philosophy seriously. But it's just honestly because I really think our society would be much richer if it engaged more seriously with philosophy. I blame philosophers as much for this as anybody, that they don't reach out enough trying to communicate their work in a more accessible way. So it's a big problem with our culture, I think.
There was that beautiful knowledge argument by Frank Jackson. Could you just introduce that?
The knowledge argument is this very famous thought experiment by the Australian philosopher Frank Jackson. So Mary is a genius neuroscientist. She knows everything physical that goes on in the body and brain when people experience color. So which wavelength of light hits the retina of the eyes, the changes it makes, the neurons it makes fire, and how that ultimately cascades into generating behavior. So she knows all of that, but for some reason that's never quite explained, she's been raised in a black and white room. So she's only ever seen black or white, black and white and shades of grey. She's never experienced other colours. So that's the setup. And then at the climax of the story, she's liberated from her black and white prison. Let's say there's a bright red rose on the threshold of the room, and she experiences colour for the first time. And at that point, Mary learns something new, what it's like to see red, right? That is information she couldn't discern from all the physical science she knew about. People always get the point of this a little bit wrong. I recently debated on a university campus the physicist Sean Carroll. I made the audience gasp by saying he wouldn't get a good grade in my course because he didn't understand the knowledge argument. But he made a very common mistake. People always think, well, if physicalism is true, why can't blind people experience color when they read neuroscience? Why would anyone think that, right? Nobody would think that. Of course, whether you can see color is about, what's going on in your brain, right? That's not the point. The point is, Mary in her black and white room before she was liberated had all the information. That's the core of it. If physicalism is true, neuroscience is the complete hypothesis of color experience, there was nothing more for her to learn. So Mary shouldn't have been able to get more information about color experience, and yet she does. She learns about the qualitative character of a red experience. It's a piece of information she couldn't get out of the physical science. So there's more to consciousness than what physical science can teach us about. That's essentially the core of it. I mean, in a way, it's a way of more forcefully pressing this point that because of the radical vocabulary difference between the qualitative concepts we use to describe our experience and the quantitative concepts we use to describe our brain, you're never going to be able to tell a complete explanatory story of the former in terms of the latter.
Philip, now obviously today we're talking about your new book, but maybe we should frame it by talking about your previous book.
Good. So, well, my first book in 2017 was Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, which is very much an academic book aimed at graduate students or professors in philosophy. And then a couple of years later, in 2019, Galileo's error was an attempt to communicate those ideas for a general audience, which I think philosophers annoyingly don't do enough. The book traces the problem of consciousness back to what I believe are its origins in the intellectual foundations of the scientific revolution, in the way Galileo designed what he called natural philosophy, what we now call physical science. Before Galileo, people naturally took it that the world around them is filled with qualities, right? There's colors on the surfaces of objects, smells floating through the air, tastes inside food. Galileo thought, correctly, I think, that you can't capture these kinds of qualities in the purely quantitative language of mathematics, right? An equation can't capture that deep red you experience as you watch a setting sun. So Galileo got around this by proposing a radically new philosophical hypothesis about reality, according to which those qualities aren't really out there in the world, rather they're in the consciousness of the observer. The redness of a tomato isn't really on the surface of the tomato, it's in the consciousness of the person observing it. So Galileo strips the physical world of its qualities, sticks them in the soul, they're outside of the physical world, and after that, everything that's left can be described in the purely quantitative language of mathematics. So we get mathematical science. Now that's gone really, really well for the past 400 years and produced incredible technology. I now think we're at a stage of history where, we're so blown away by the success of physical science and the wonderful things it's produced that people think, that's everything, that's the complete story, it's going to explain everything, it's going to explain consciousness. Whereas the irony is, it's gone so well precisely because it was designed to exclude consciousness. So if we want to fully bring consciousness into the scientific story, I think we need to rethink that picture of science bequeathed to us by Galileo, and I think panpsychism looks to be the best way to do that.
One thing I was interested in, Philip, and you can expand on this, is we've had substance dualism, which is what Richard Swinburne was talking about. And these days we have methodological dualism, which is to say anything above the neck is treated differently. So one reading of what you were saying about Galileo is that it's treating mental states as kind of distinct from what happens in the world. And I don't think that's what you're espousing, is it?
No. Yeah, I mean, actually, in philosophy, in academic philosophy, probably the dominant contemporary view is that the kinds of concepts we use to describe the physical universe and the kinds of concepts we use to describe consciousness are just radically different. And there's no way to really integrate them. So these physicalists agree with me. We describe the physical universe with these purely quantitative, third-personal concepts. We describe our consciousness with these very different kind of qualitative, subjective concepts of colors and sounds and smells and tastes. Now, they agree that in terms of how we think and talk about things, it's dualistic. These are radically different categories. But for some reason, they think that doesn't affect the ontology. That doesn't affect our theory of reality. In terms of reality, there's just one kind of stuff, physical stuff. It's just that we have these two very different ways of describing it. And to my mind, that is very, very, to say the least, very, very unsatisfying. If you think about any other domain, science aspires to integrate, to unify, to explain. Once you learn about the underlying chemistry, you get a really intelligible explanation. So it seems to me, if physicalism were true, if consciousness were wholly explicable in terms of electrochemical signaling in the brain, then we ought to be able to tell that same kind of intelligible, explanatory story. We ought to explain why red experiences have that reddish quality in terms of underlying facts about neural firings. In philosophy, at least, physicalists have given up on that explanatory project. That's really a deep problem with physicalism. It's really not living up to its explanatory obligations in a way, I guess.
Physics describes what things do, not what they are. And you said in your book, Philip, that science is not the full story of reality. So how does philosophy go about finding out about reality?
I mean, that's really the core of the insights that Bertrand Russell was having in the 1920s that very much inform the contemporary panpsychist philosophy and research program. In the public mind, physical science is this ongoing process of telling us more about the nature of space and time and matter. We're getting this more and more complete story. What Russell realized in the 1920s, particularly in his 1927 book, The Analysis of Matter, was that actually physics is confined to telling us what stuff does, how it behaves. Think about what does physics tell us about particles when it tells us they have mass and charge? Well, how does physics characterize mass and charge? Mass is characterized in terms of gravitational attraction and resistance to acceleration. Charge is characterized in terms of attraction and repulsion. So actually, when you reflect on it, physics isn't really telling us what an electron is. It's telling us what an electron does. I sometimes say physics is a bit like playing chess when you don't know what the pieces are made of. Right? You know what they do, and that's important. You know what moves you can make. That's the kind of information you need to build incredible technology, knowing what stuff does. But in terms of what stuff is, what an electron or a quark actually is, physics leaves us completely in the dark. Russell realizes this huge hole in our standard scientific story of the universe. His genius insight then was to connect it to the problem of consciousness, right? We're struggling to find a place for consciousness in our standard scientific story of the universe. We've got this hole. Maybe we can put consciousness in the hole. So the essence of the Bertrand Russell-inspired panpsychist position is that physics tells us what matter does. Consciousness is what matter is. So we have a way of rejecting dualism on the one hand, but also rejecting the reductionist aspirations of physicalism that I think have been shown to be incoherent and uncompletable. Instead, we have this unified picture where there's just matter, but consciousness is the intrinsic essential nature of matter.
Is this in any way related to this dichotomy of epistemology and ontology? Physicists are building models, essentially, of reality. Empirically, the models have predictive power, but you're making the case that there is an ontological gap between these models that the physicists are building and what actually happens.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. I think that it is, of course, controversial among philosophers of science whether science is telling us anything about the nature of reality or whether it's merely a useful tool for prediction. If you take the view that actually physics isn't telling us about the nature of reality, well, then it's perfectly open for someone like a panpsychist, if they believe consciousness exists and we need a place for it, to put that in the gap where science leaves us in the dark. So I wouldn't go quite that far myself. I don't take the instrumentalist view that physics is just a useful tool for prediction. I think physics does tell us information about reality, but it's seriously constrained in the kinds of information it can give us about reality. Essentially, physics tells us how stuff behaves, what it does. When it comes to consciousness, though, I think it's a radically different explanatory project, right? We're not trying to explain complex, publicly observable behavior. We're trying to explain these invisible, subjective qualities that you can't get at from the outside, as it were, but we're immediately aware of in our own conscious experience. So it's a very different explanatory project.
I would like to point out to the audience that Philip has a podcast called MindChat with Keith Frankish, and I've been listening to it for years. Not only that, when I think about topics on MindChat, in my mind's eye, I use the voice of Philip Goff, which means I place a certain emphasis on certain things. It reminds me of John Ronson. Do you remember? And I thought he was a psychopath. But no, seriously, everyone should subscribe to MindChat. It's an incredible podcast. In fact, just tell me the story of that.
Thanks for the plug. Sorry to be invading your consciousness on a regular basis. Yeah, well, Keith and I, we met in 2014 on a sailing ship in the Arctic. A trip paid for by Dmitry Volkov, a Russian investor and consciousness enthusiast who wanted a dozen philosophers to sail around the Arctic chatting about free will and consciousness, and some graduate students from Moscow State University. It was mainly sort of Dennett type people. Obviously Keith is someone on that side of the debate. But then they said, come on, you need some people to disagree with you. So they got David Chalmers and Martin Niederhumelen, who's a very good German substance dualist, and myself as the panpsychist. So we were sort of the official onboard oppositions of some heated debates in a cold, frosty climate. And Keith and I obviously disagreed quite profoundly, but really got on, actually. I think I really loved that, actually. I really love trying to get in the headspace of people whose views I just find absolutely baffling. Can give you a different perspective on your own view. So yeah, a long time later, we were both individually thinking of starting a podcast, and then we both had the idea we could do it together. Partly we're trying to model constructive disagreement in these polarized times, how people with radically different views can talk in a calm, civilized, kind way. In that spirit, we engage with scientists and philosophers of consciousness, probing them from our very different perspectives. Very, very low budget, nothing like this incredibly sophisticated setup you got going on here. Yeah, I call it the podcast with the lowest production values and the greatest philosophy.
We have a copy of your beautiful book, and I was wondering, Philip, if you could sign it for me.
I would be honoured. It's a good cover, isn't it?
It is.
Pleased with how that worked out.
What are you going to say, Philip?
Happy thinking. Well, happy thinking is my standard thing. Maybe I should add, whether illusory or not. Oh no, 2024, isn't it?
Yes. Don't worry.
The date's a bit messy.
It's all a fiction. So, Philip, it's been an absolute honour to have you on MLST. What have we done today?
We have asked the fundamental questions of agency, consciousness, purpose. I think we've sorted it all out for me. I think I can go and retire now.
We've set the world to rights, haven't we? Thank you so much, Philip.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Lovely.
Cool. We're done.